from 8 p.m., American Public Media.
20 minutes of reading a day paves the way to success. Use technology to your advantage. Educational apps and audiobooks can make reading more interactive and accessible. For more information, readjax.org.
The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjax.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler. On today's First Coast Connect, from the Big Beautiful Bill to displays of military power and parades, we get political analysis of the latest national headlines with Jacksonville University public policy expert Rick Mullaney. Then, Florida's post-Roe reality, what a plummeting abortion rate reveals about the state's healthcare landscape for women, and a musical celebration of Juneteenth at the annual St. Augustine Music Festival. We'll tell you how you can participate. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937 or email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. It's all ahead this hour.
In Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. There's been a major plane crash in western India today. An Air India flight with 242 passengers and crew crashed shortly after takeoff. They were bound for London. NPR's Dia Hadid reports from Mumbai. Local police say it appears everyone aboard has been killed.
Footage shared by the outlet Press Trust of India showed the plane sinking over a residential quarter of the western Indian city of Ahmedabad, and then the sound of a blast and a ball of fire. The Press Trust then shared images of medics rushing casualties on stretchers. The chairman of the group that operates Air India said in a statement that its flight, which was bound for London's Gatwick Airport, was involved in a tragic incident. The Associated Press reports that it's the first crash of this kind of aircraft, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner. Reuters said the aircraft gave a mayday call, signaling an emergency before it crashed. The last accident involving Air India was in 2020, when more than 20 people were killed. Dia Hadid, NPR News, Mumbai.
The overnight curfew has expired. For the 1 square mile of downtown Los Angeles, the city has been mostly quiet. There have been several days of sometimes violent clashes between protesters opposing federal immigration raids and law enforcement. President Trump has ordered thousands of National Guard troops and U.S. Marines to L.A., saying the city would have burned. California authorities are suing Trump to stop the deployments. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass says the raids and the deployments make the situation worse.
When you raid Home Depots and workplaces, when you tear parents and children apart, and when you run armored caravans through our streets, you're not trying to keep anyone safe. You're trying to cause fear and panic.
But speaking to a U.S. Senate panel yesterday, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth refused to rule out the possibility that President Trump could order more U.S. military troops to even more U.S. cities. Meanwhile, another operation appears to be taking hold in California's heartland. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials reportedly went to several farms on Tuesday. From member station KVPR, Joshua Yeager reports.
Federal agents targeted at least 3 California farms. The United Farm Workers Union tells NPR some of their members witnessed the raids. Videos posted on social media also shows ICE agents chasing workers down in a field. Teresa Romero leads the United Farm Workers. She says Trump is going after the wrong people with his current immigration policies.
It is just horrible what's happening to our people and in our communities, to people who have been working in agriculture for decades, putting food on our tables, families being separated, children living in fear. It's just heartbreaking.
ICE did not immediately return NPR's comment request. For NPR News, I'm Joshua Yeager in Bakersfield, California.
This is NPR.
You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning, I'm Stephen Ponson. It is now 9:04. The airport on US 1 in St. Augustine has changed names multiple times over the years, and Governor Ron DeSantis just approved the latest change. It has been called the Northeast Florida Regional Airport for a decade, but its name is changing to the St. Augustine Airport. That's the name the airport was known as before it changed to the Regional Airport 15 years ago. Officials say the change will help clear up confusion about where the airport is located. People know where St. Augustine is, but the Northeast Florida region also includes Jacksonville, which has Jacksonville International Airport and others. Local lawmaker Kim Kendall filed the bill to change the airport's name, and DeSantis signed that change into law early on this week. On June 12, 2016, a terrorist opened fire in Orlando's Pulse nightclub, killing 49 people and wounding 53 others. For the first time since the mass shooting, survivors and family members of those who were killed are getting to spend a little time inside the long-shuttered, gay-friendly venue before it's demolished this week and then eventually replaced with a permanent memorial. As a mark of respect, Governor DeSantis ordered the U.S. and Florida state flags to be flown at half-staff from sunrise to sunset today. Shower activity mainly west of Highway 301 later on this afternoon, as we can expect highs in the lower 90s inland and a little bit cooler out at the beaches. Highs there will be in the upper 80s. Overnight, lows will drop down into the 70s again.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Lilly Endowment, a private foundation supporting NPR's coverage of religion and spirituality, and Jarl and Pamela Mohn, focusing on civil liberties, foster youth, public radio, and the arts.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, it's been a hectic few weeks of national news, from widespread immigration crackdowns to withering social media spats. A local expert helps us break down the politics and policy of an increasingly erratic era. Later in the program, Florida's 6-week abortion ban has caused the number of procedures to drop nearly in half, and a local clinic has cut its hours 50%. We break down what the numbers mean for providers and patients. But first, Rick Mullaney is executive director of the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute, and he joins us periodically to help us interpret the world. Rick, thanks so much for being here.
Good morning, Ann. Good to be with you.
Good. We need you more than ever, and so much to discuss. I would like to start, I guess, talking about this week that's sort of bookended by military displays on both coasts. We've got protests in Los Angeles this weekend, a parade this next weekend in Washington, D.C. So let's start with what's happening kind of in Los Angeles. The Trump administration this week calling out the National Guard and some 700 Marines. That's actually more soldiers and Marines in Los Angeles now than in Iraq and Syria, apparently. And so quite a show of force or presence.
Clearly it is, and it's obviously captured the nation's attention. But I'd say, Ann, if you were to go back to the escalator ride that Donald Trump had a decade ago, it was this summer, 10 years ago. And over the past decade, his rise as president, his losing of the presidency, and now in his second term, if you were to go to one issue that has been defining for Donald Trump, it is immigration, his signature issue, really. And so far in his second term, that is the one issue in particular, dropping popularity on some other issues, but that's one where he's had some success. Number one, he has secured the border, dramatic drop in those border crossings. But now we're getting into something much harder, which is what he promised in the campaign, which is mass deportation of illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants. And so for Donald Trump and for the country, he has wide support in the deportation of illegal immigrants who've committed a crime, for example. That's pretty straightforward, big support. He also has it for support for those who have outstanding orders of deportation. That may come from a judge who they sought asylum, but they didn't get it. So that he can do, and he's got broad support. Now we're getting into something harder. That is the ICE raids, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. When they go to deport illegal immigrants, now we're getting into that area of people who are here illegally, who he can deport, but who may have been here for many years peacefully and in their jobs, and they now have families. This is harder. There's no allegation of false advertising with Donald Trump because in the campaign, he said this was exactly what he would do. And as you've seen in this, what's happened in Los Angeles, and I do want to get to the troop deployment in just a second, but it does highlight a fundamental difference here. Mayor Bass, for example, in Los Angeles, has said, stop the ICE raids. And Donald Trump has said, I ran on ICE raids, and not only are we going to do ICE raids in Los Angeles, we're going to do them in other places around the country. It is a fundamental policy divide that he ran on. So when they began these raids last week, started last Friday with ICE raids in Los Angeles, protesters began to mount, about 800 protesters. And then on Saturday, for Donald Trump, deployed the National Guard. And in terms of history and tradition, somewhat unprecedented because he did it not only without the consent of the governor, Governor Newsom, he did it over the objection of the governor. And so that has created a real clash in the deployment or the federalization, actually, of the California National Guard. And then later on, earlier this week, on Monday, you saw the deployment, not to be used with protesters, but in the protection of federal buildings and personnel, something he can do because there's legal issues we can discuss around this, with the Marines being deployed. Mm-hmm. And so what you've highlighted in the beginning of the show is something very significant, and that is in Los Angeles and San Francisco, the ICE raids, the protests, the arrests, and the deployment of the National Guard, and to some capacity, for now, the U.S. Marines. Very extraordinary.
I want to hear a little bit from both Governor Newsom and President Trump right now discussing this issue. Let's start, if we can, with the sound from Gavin Newsom.
California may be first, but it clearly will not end here. Other states are next. Democracy is next. Democracy is under assault before our eyes. This moment we have feared has arrived.
So the governor there kind of issuing almost a warning of sorts. Let's hear what the president had to say about this issue.
Under the Trump administration, this anarchy will not stand. We will not allow federal agents to be attacked, and we will not allow an American city to be invaded and conquered by a foreign enemy. And that's what they are.
So obviously, two very different perspectives there. You know, I mean, we've seen that the president does have this broad support for deporting people who have, you know, criminal records or violent criminal records. But that these, you know, we're seeing people who've had their temporary protective status revoked and therefore are kind of suddenly illegal in this country, or people who are actually checking in with the Department of Homeland Security as they're required and going to these check-ins and then being detained, which, you know, those are what some people are saying are kind of acts that are required to meet the numbers that this president has promised in terms of mass deportations.
It's a really, really difficult issue. And as you saw with Governor Newsom, and that language he was using is sounds like a great deal of language that you may hear in 2028, sort of the presidential politics overhanging both of this. And for Governor Newsom, he's talking to the blue states and to those other states with what's happening in Los Angeles.
Yeah, some are saying he launched his presidential bid this
many believe so, and certainly appealing to the base of the Democratic Party. But his language about, you know, democracy under attack, that's not that different from past arguments. And so, but very much plays well to the base. And in Donald Trump's argument that foreign invaders, boy, that's another way to try to reposition this issue. But in the end, it comes back to something I highlighted in the beginning of the show, which is a fundamental divide on the deportation issue and the deportation of illegal immigrants and under what circumstances that's appropriate. I think there's a real danger here for Donald Trump that he overplays his hand. So far, he believes he's got the political high ground. He believes that from a political standpoint, he's on solid footing and he has the backing of the American people. And in fact, during his second term, I would put immigration, energy, and maybe some cultural arguments such as, you know, no men playing in women's sports. Those are where he's really done reasonably well. In other areas, you've seen declining poll numbers and support, particularly on tariffs, Ukraine, a number of other areas. So this clash, I think the president wants, actually. He is not backing off from it, and I think he was looking for this. He forecast that he would be doing this during the campaign. He specifically mentioned Los Angeles and San Francisco as sanctuary cities, California as a sanctuary state, and that he would not hesitate to deploy troops, if necessary, to support ICE raids and deportation. And that's exactly what he's done.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to Rick Mullaney about national, political, and presidential headlines. And if you have comments or questions, you can give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on Facebook, Instagram, or X at FCC On Air. We've got a call from James on the South Side. Good morning, James. Welcome to First Coast Connect.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. The people voted for the economy. They didn't vote for ICE raids. ICE raids came along with that vote, but it is about the economy. We did not have that. The other thing, I think the fundamental issue is not necessarily about these foreign nationals or whatever. The fundamental issue is honesty, or the lack thereof. We have a party that traffics in lies. I'm still looking for the fraud that led to Brandon being elected 4 years ago. I don't think until we have responsible and ethical leaders, we're going to continue to have this discourse, and it's what we got to focus on. We've got to have responsible and ethical leaders and responsible behaviors. Honesty, it's respect, courage, and accountability. And we have a party that doesn't want to have the courage to stand up for truth. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thanks, James.
Well, James's first comment about the last election in November being about the economy, I certainly agree with him. If you were to ask me what the number one issue was, I think it was the economy. And for President Biden, the 20% inflation was a signature number and a signature problem that substantially contributed to Donald Trump's victory, was the economy. But as I mentioned earlier in the program, the other issue that Donald Trump did win on, because he thought it was a political winner, and for a decade is immigration. And that's where we are in this challenge. I certainly agree with James that we want honest and respected leaders. I think that's true. However, we do get into these, and I wish we could do this in a more civil way, we do get into these very difficult policy issues, because this really is public policy. We're talking about what is the correct path forward for the country on immigration, and how do we execute? How do we do this? I think much of the argument that we're having about is the execution on this too, as well as the policy. But there is a fundamental policy divide, and there's a very fundamental partisan divide. I think when you take a look at Los Angeles and San Francisco and in other areas around the country, it is being viewed through a partisan lens. And you can see that in the commentary, you can see it in the coverage, and I think you see it in the way people feel about it.
Sure, which makes policy a lot harder to get to. We've got a call from John in St. Augustine. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to commend your guest, Rick, for his great unbiased presentation of the facts on the ground. That's so refreshing to hear, just that here it is without a side to it, just a laying of the facts. I wish we could see more of that in our media. And then the second thing I want to say is whether or not you agree or disagree with what President Trump is doing, I think it's also refreshing to finally have a politician who does what he says he was going to do all along. So at least you know where he stands, you know what's happening, you were warned. Too often on both parties, we get politicians that say one thing and do another. And in this case, at least you're going to get exactly what you were told you were going to get. And I think we need to see more of that in our politicians. Thank you. And that's it.
Thank you, John.
Well, I certainly appreciated the first comment. John, thank you for that. Listen, this is difficult. It's really hard. We do try to call balls and strikes. We do try to lay it out as best we can. But even when you do that, I think from both the right and the left, you're probably going to get some criticism if you aren't quite where people want to be. And so in the commentary in the past, I have been people who take exception from the left and the right. And so, but appreciate that comment. Your second point is interesting, this notion of he did what he said. And it's true to a large extent. And as I said earlier, he did run on this. And you can't argue that it's a surprise. I think the Democratic argument is that he was very quick on the trigger to deploy National Guard. And their argument is against the deployment of National Guard when they believed they had sufficient local law enforcement to handle this. Now, you did have a local sheriff said we're overwhelmed. And I think what happens if you're a sanctuary city like Los Angeles and that state, I think you have to be hyper vigilant in enforcing the laws, because Donald Trump, if he saw the opening, if he thought it was necessary to enforce what he promised on the campaign trail, he was going to do it. So I believe he was looking for an opportunity. Los Angeles served one up. But the caller's point is a pretty interesting and good one, that elected officials, sometimes they tell you exactly what they're going to do, and he's following up on what he's doing it. I think the Democrats are being critical, however, of how he's going about accomplishing.
Well, sure, and the question of kind of deploying Marines is an order of magnitude different, though, is not. I mean, because that's where we're starting to talk about whether there is, whether norms and laws are being followed, as opposed to just promises kept.
There's no doubt that's true. But let me say this, even in the lawsuit filed in California, and the Attorney General had their argument in the court this week, and in their brief, They acknowledged in the brief pretty explicitly that the president has the authority to deploy Marines to protect the building and to personnel. That's one issue. What the bigger step would be if they were to actively engage with the protesters, if they were to arrest people, if they were to be providing armed security. And you haven't seen that happen yet.
Well, they have been accompanying, have they not, ICE agents as they've been, or officers.
The
even.
protection of personnel in the building is one thing. The engagement, I think, with the protesters is another. And you're talking about historical norms. It is way out of the norm. I mean, and it's a serious matter to be deploying U.S. military to engage domestically. It's been over half a century, since you've seen the Insurrection Act used in this way. You saw it with Lyndon Johnson, you saw it with Kennedy, you saw it with Eisenhower. Those were instances involving civil unrest and desegregation. You saw it with Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War. Remember, on the legal basis, what Donald Trump has invoked so far has been Title 10. And under that act, he can do it in certain circumstances, including rebellion. And he thinks some of this maybe falls in that category. But the bigger standard...
Well, he's been labeling protesters insurrectionists.
Well, that goes to the second basis, and that's under the 1807 Insurrection Act. And that is the one invoked, as I mentioned before, by President Johnson, President Kennedy, and also President Eisenhower. Very rarely used. It was used, by the way, but with the consent of the governor back in the early 90s with H.W. Bush with the Rodney King protests. So in looking at this, is this out of the ordinary? It really is. It's non-traditional. He's pushing the limits of executive power. But Donald Trump, in his second term, as Joe Biden did, he pushed it too. But Donald Trump is really pushing the limits of executive power, for example, on tariffs, which we've seen, on law firms, with those executive orders on law firms, with higher education, particularly Harvard, and now you're seeing it on immigration. So in this second term, Donald Trump certainly found his sea legs. Donald Trump 2.0 is different from Donald Trump 1.0, and he certainly does push the limits of executive power.
We've got a call from Kendra in Mandarin. Good morning, Kendra. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm calling to speak about the disproportionate response of our president to the LA protests. This is not about public safety or about protecting security personnel. If it were, why was all the support not sent in on January 6th? This is just showboating, and I think it's just strongman, big daddy politics, just another display of unilateral power by our power-seeking president. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kendra. We also have a call from Lorraine in Jacksonville. Good morning, Lorraine. Go ahead.
Yes. The lady just took my thunder about January 6th. Are we talking out of both sides of our mouths? Because we saw law officers beat, some died. They tore up the Capitol, which is a federal building. So why do we have this? And we also saw them fly in with our money, the Africanos, and they got immediate citizenship and gratuities. I really don't understand. We're not teaching our children right. You know, this is bad history.
Thanks, Lorraine. And obviously she's referring to the South Africans that were allowed into the country when she's talking about the Afrikaners there.
Yeah, I think both callers very articulate in making the point that a lot of Democrats make is that there's a double standard, and that for Donald Trump, and where was he in the deploying of these troops when it came to January 6th? Others have pointed, by the way, the reluctance to deploy troops not only in January 6th, but in other circumstances. You saw it with the post George Floyd riots that took place in Minneapolis and Portland and other areas. But I think the callers do make a good point. But then you have to ask yourself the point: should they have been deployed on January 6th? Many believe yes. But what does that precedent mean for what's going on in Los Angeles? I think the first caller was talking about Donald Trump she said showboating, but I think she's kind of making a point that I made earlier. I do think he did see an opening and an opportunity to move forward on a high priority for him. And whether or not this was proportional or not is kind of in the eye of the beholder. There's a partisan divide on that question. But in the end, in the litigation right now, as to whether or not he has this authority, this is an untested area under the statute, under Title 10, sort of novel arguments. I think the courts are going to give a lot of deference to the executive and the use of authority in this way. But I do think that the callers make some compelling points.
Got a call from Daryl in St. Augustine. Good morning, Daryl. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning, Ann. Just 2 points. One, this is not about immigration. If you wanted to solve immigration, it would be very simple. You go throw the CEO who hires the immigrants in jail, not the poor people sitting in front of Home Depot. Go throw the guy from Smithfield Food who makes $27 million a year and has thousands of illegal immigrants or migrant workers working in his slaughterhouses. But that doesn't happen. We just go and arrest the poor and the weak. We don't arrest the people that are actually responsible for this. That's my first point. The second point is this is a total show. This is just his TV show using our government to create as much of a show as he can to get his name out there every single day. It's just create controversy, and that's what's going to be on TV. It's the same thing over and over. Create craziness. Everybody will report and talk about the craziness while he's stealing billions of dollars.
Thanks, Daryl. Appreciate it.
Well, he does make a couple points that are important. One is he brings up really the economic issue when he talks about the CEOs. And one of the things to keep in mind here is the economic impact of those illegal immigrants that have been here maybe for years, who have not committed a crime, who have gainfully employed, and are fulfilling some important roles in the economy. And that is one of the things that I think the president's going to have to keep in mind. I don't necessarily think the Trump administration, particularly those who are the architects of this mass deportation, would say that the people are poor and weak in terms of illegal immigration. That depends on how you want to frame this issue. There is a big partisan divide in this country on how you address that issue. And Republicans argue that in the Biden years, millions and millions of illegal immigrants poured into the country. They're now here, and that Donald Trump promised to deport them, and that's exactly what he's doing. This notion of it's a total show, there are certainly high-profile matter here in which Donald Trump, I think, seized a moment. But in the end, it does come back to this very fundamental question of the deportations, the ICE raids, whether those ICE raids should go forward. Many are fundamentally arguing that the ICE raids should stop. Donald Trump wants those ICE raids to continue.
We have a call from Jessica in Riverside. Good morning, Jessica. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you. I just wanted to make a point that Donald Trump has a history of bias towards people he doesn't care for. With the accusation of his New York appointments, some racial bias, with the newspaper articles and pictures that he put of the exonerated 5 asking for their execution, wanting a Muslim ban. And now it just seems he's finally found a way to legally persecute people he doesn't care for. That's just basically my point. Thank you, everyone, for all your comments.
Thanks, Jessica. We appreciate yours as well. We also have a call from Ed in Clay County. Good morning, Ed. Go ahead.
Yeah, great show as always. A couple of points. CNN, not Fox, had announced a poll they did yesterday, or the day before yesterday, on the way that the legal immigrants is looking at what's happening in L.A. And they came out that it has increased the support to the Republicans and Trump. I think a lot of it has to do because so many of those legal immigrants have businesses that are getting looted. And this is a pattern that we see. The other thing is that it's also, the comparison to January 6th is also very interesting. January 6th lasted 4 hours, and it was stopped with the local police force, mostly of the Capitol. The mayor of Washington never called for the National Guard. So it's not like they called and the president refused to send the help. Here we have the mayor of LA and the governor who don't want any of the National Guard. And fortunately, they have only sent to protect federal buildings as they should. I don't think they should be used for anything else. Now, the concern that everybody has for the police, like what happened after January 6th. I think that's wonderful, and I hope they're going to do the same here. they're going to follow for the next few months all these thousands of policemen who have been dealing with this for now a week, not 4 hours, and follow their health situation and see if anybody died from suicide or from any medical conditions.
All right.
And connect it to the riots. That seems to be fair.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you so much. We also have a call from Eunice on the South Side. Good morning, Eunice. Go ahead.
Good morning. And if all these people are really upset, and I am upset because we're about to lose our democracy, please show up Saturday morning at the courthouse at 10 o'clock. I think there are 4 events around the city, but we need to show up at the courthouse to show we did not elect a king. Please, we need your bodies and your signs, and please be respectful of each other. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Eunice. I mean, that does kind of move us to this other topic we were talking about. You know, there is a couple of things happening this weekend. One are these multi-city so-called No Kings protests that have been planned for a while. Also, same day, this giant celebration of the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army. That's going to be celebrated in a kind of a grand fashion in Washington, D.C. It also happens to be the president's birthday, but this is something that he said he wanted to do. We're going to see, you know, a display of kind of military might, tanks going down Constitution Avenue, that kind of thing.
You know, Ann, the last 3 calls in which you just outlined highlight something I talk about a great deal, which is the very deep partisan divide that we have in the country. And while the Trump administration, for example, has portrayed this as a landslide election victory in November, the truth is it was very much a close election, significant. I'm not taking away from sweeping all 7 swing states, which he did, and the first Republican to get the popular vote in 20 years. That's a big deal. But he had 77 million votes, and Kamala Harris had 75 million. And in the big blue states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, 2%. If it went 2% the other way, Kamala Harris would have won. I say that only to highlight the fact that partisan divide remains, and that will be on display this weekend and in these protests around the country, because the divide is alive and well. And this notion of no kings is part of that divide because of the dissatisfaction of half of the country with President Trump. But I do think the Democratic challenge is coming up with where they've lost their footing in terms of what is their message to the entire country. With Donald Trump, you may not like his message. Half the country does, but you know what his message is. He's about securing the border. He's about mass deportation. He's about energy independence. He's about the cultural battles of no men playing in women's sports. And he's been forceful on that. And I think
and tariffs.
And tariffs. Oh, no question on tariffs. And so that he does have a message for the tariffs, by the way, he kind of co-opted the Democratic side because historically the Republicans were the party of free trade and the Democrats were the protectionist party and the party of tariffs. And so it's been an interesting thing to see. And you've seen that in foreign policy where there's been a bit of a flip, where the Republicans were much more about international leadership and concern, of course, in Ukraine and other areas, and the Democrats.
Sure. I mean,
it's been an amazing sort of.
You also hear Democrats all the time talking about law and order, which was certainly not the kind of thing that you heard them, you know, out and about saying that we've got to return to law and order. I mean, that, you know, this is a time when they're now considering this administration lawless, and all of a sudden they're, you know, the voice of.
It is. It's been a fascinating thing to see, but and you're right. But for the callers and for your point, I think it goes back to this divide, and for I think the Democrats who are struggling to find their footing, their policy footing. The No Kings is a message, but that's a message that has been used quite a bit. The we're against Donald Trump message is one message. But the other message, whether it's going to be on the economy, immigration, energy, prices, inflation, foreign policy, those are the messages, and what are you going to do there? And so I do expect this divide is not going away. It is deepening. There's deep dissatisfaction with President Trump in multiple areas, particularly on the left, and some growing somewhat on the right. But as you've seen from a couple of our callers, there's also a great deal of support for Donald Trump, that he ran on certain things. He's delivering on those things. They wanted to see him deliver on those things. And as one caller talked about it, even those who are Hispanic and other groups growing support, in part because many of them have businesses, but many of them also found a legal pathway to to American citizenship themselves. So this is a very difficult issue and a very emotional issue.
Do you think that the fact that these protests are framed around this no kings and kind of somewhat less about personality and maybe more about policy, that it will involve people from the other side of that divide, or do you think it really is just a partisan display?
Oh, I do think the protest, the support for the protest is more partisan than not. But I do think the movement away from the more personal to the policy is the right pathway. And I do think that on the Democratic side in particular, there's got to be that broader appeal and that policy appeal, and also to get the politics right. Because Donald Trump, I believe, is underrated when it comes to his marketing skills and his political skills. He is very skilled politically, and you're seeing some of that on display in LA and San Francisco. He does not mind this fight. He is embracing this fight. He thinks he has the political high ground. But I will say this, it's risky for him. He could overplay his hand here. God forbid that someone die. God forbid that there's serious injuries that go on here, an American citizen, particularly at the hands of law enforcement. You don't want to see that. But he needs to tread very carefully, and this needs to be de-escalated, not only in Los Angeles, but de-escalated because you're seeing some of these protests spreading around the rest of the country.
I do want to talk a little bit about this big, beautiful bill, because that is a matter that is sort of before us and, has created some problems for Republicans because, being big and kind of all-inclusive, it includes some things that are not popular with some members, including this enormous increase that, kind of comes to the national debt, some, tax increases that are going to continue and, are going to have some real revenue and financial implications for the years ahead. And some Republicans have indicated they don't really have a stomach for that. And yet there kind of is no saying no to this president.
I think in the end it's going to pass, but I wish we had a lot of time to discuss this bill. But let me just mention a couple elements. One is tax policy. What you're seeing a consensus for virtually all the Republicans is the extension of the 2017 Trump tax cuts. Otherwise, as they frame it, you're going to see a $4 to $5 trillion tax increase. And I think their argument is that the CBO isn't calculating this correctly. This is the argument they're making because all the other studies disagree with them, that this tax issue is a really big deal because that involves fundamentally the extension of those tax cuts, which are set to expire this year. Now, Donald Trump has layered on top of those tax cuts for overtime, tax cuts for no tips. They're in the bill, at least the House version, it does not include no tax for Social Security. But the tax cut piece is a piece that is scored heavily by the CBO for the deficit. But the second piece, apart from the tax cuts, is the increased spending on the security and defense. And then they go to cut spending, and where do they turn? A lot of that is Medicare. And you're seeing the Medicare cuts, but the argument is they're imposing work requirements, and with the result of those work requirements, you're going to see some decreases there. Bottom line for the Republican hawks, we're a nation that's close to $37 trillion in debt. They are concerned that the current projections of $2.4 trillion being added to the national deficit is too much. I think what you're going to see is a version come out of the Senate that looks quite a bit different from the one that comes out of the House. At the end of the day, through reconciliation, I believe a bill is going to get passed. For Donald Trump, he has to pass this bill in some form. It may not be exactly what he has in mind. I think it does get passed in some form.
We've got a call from Vince. Good morning, Vince. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. Thank you for the program. I have a quick observation and then a question for the guests that you have. This program's great, by the way. One, I've noticed just in listening to the news lately, there's kind of this reductionist point of view on what is immigration. It all gets lumped into the phrasing of immigrants or immigration versus kind of a delineation between legal and illegal. And I think that happens on kind of both sides of the argument. And I think that may be where the politics gets a little confusing because, I think there's a difference between the two, and we're just conflating it. That's one observation in the media, even this morning on NPR, which I love. Second, my question to the guests would be, maybe you touched on this earlier, but what is exactly the legal options that the president does have in the protection of federal buildings and federal personnel, and how they've been exercised in the most recent future? Just some great examples, maybe in the last 50, 100 years, where you've seen that happen. That's my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Vince.
Good comments, Vince. On the first point, I think he's right that it does get conflated and it does get to the point. And there's a big difference between legal versus illegal immigration. And honestly, many are advocates for expanding the number of legal immigrants. My grandfather immigrated to this country with a fourth grade education, and my mother didn't learn to speak English until grade school. I think many of us are the children and grandchildren of immigrants who went through the process and are here legally. But this fight is not over them on this issue. It is over this issue of illegal immigration. So he does make a good point, and it does sometimes get inflated. But his second point is something that we have talked about a bit, and that is the president has broad authority to deploy troops for the protection of federal buildings and personnel. That's really not the challenge. The real challenge is the Insurrectionist Act, and when you can invoke the Insurrectionist Act to use the military, such as the Marines, for the enforcement of federal law or domestic law. And that's a very big difference. Can they make arrests? Can they help the enforcement of ICE officials? And then you'd have to meet the criteria of the Insurrection Act, which has not been invoked in more than half a century.
I want to take a call from Mokhtar in Jax. Good morning. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning, Ann. I want to say to you and to WJCT and to your panel, thank you so much for what you do every day. My wife and I have, in fact, gone to WJCT.org/protect and made sure we made our voices heard in support of funding for public radio.
Thank
but my
you
comment I want to make has to do with a comment that one of your panelists made concerning the public disapproval of President Trump's performance or his actions in office. And they made the statement 50% of the country does not approve or dislikes what's going on, which conversely would mean 50% approves or likes what's going on. That statement is repeated not only at WJCT, but through all the media all the time. And I don't understand why, because according to my knowledge, about 80 million votes were cast for Kamala Harris, 83 million for President Trump. That would mean that only less than half of the country participated. We have a population going over 300 million. I don't know how many are eligible as elected voters, but that's not half of the country. That's half of the voting electorate. It would seem more probable that 20 to 30% of the country support President Trump. That's just a comment I want to make. I'm going to take the comment off air. Thank you guys very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. We appreciate you, Mokhtar. What do you make of that? Is the partisan divide reflective of the reality for non-voters?
Yeah, I respectfully don't agree with the caller on the percentages, and I mean this kindly. If you look at our local elections, unfortunately, we get about 10 to 15% turnout. You look at the gubernatorial race, it's about 50. But when you get to presidential elections, even here in Jacksonville, it's 70 to 80% are turnout. So that 150 million
of voters,
of people registered. But 330 million is correct, but many of them are children and many of them are non-voters. But apart from voting, the polling broadly nationally does reflect a national divide. And I was using 50-50 as just sort of a way of generalization. If you look at the polling, the president's approval rating is actually disapproval is above 50%. You have and his disapproval is above 50%. I was really trying to make the point, however, that there is a very real, deep partisan divide in the country. That's been reflected in the last several elections. And the last vote that we talked about, 77 million for Donald Trump and 75 million for Kamala Harris, does in part reflect that divide. And I think you see that divide being seen in how we view what's going on in Los Angeles.
Just about a little quick minute left here, but I did want to touch on this, Twitter spat that we saw between, a couple of billionaires, our president and Elon Musk. Do you think that that's going to be damaging long-term, that relationship rift, or do you see it already, some signs of it repairing?
Clearly some damage was done. I don't know if as a nation we've ever seen a fight quite like that one. But in that breakup between the two, it was bad for Donald Trump. It was bad for Elon Musk, really bad for the country for it to happen that way. You've now see a trend towards possibly healing it, but I think Elon Musk was right that he did go way, way far. I think people would acknowledge that he really did go very far. And it undercut his credibility on the bill because he went so far in other areas, such as the Epstein files and some of those things that he said about Donald Trump, which really, really went far. So in answer to your question, it is unclear to me if this will ever get back to where it was. But Donald Trump has a remarkable history of having big divides with people. And then if they're willing to apologize, as Musk has done, and if he wants their help, which I think he wants Musk's help, sometimes they get back into their good graces.
I mean, he's already said no hard feelings, so I guess we're on that path. Rick Mullaney, we're so lucky to have you and your good mind and your good thoughts to kind of help bring some clarity to all of this stuff. Thank you for being here.
Great being with you.
All right. Up next, Florida's post-Roe realities. We look at the state's plummeting abortion rate and what that means for providers. Welcome back. Florida's abortion rate is down nearly 46% from just last year, a figure that highlights how much has changed since the U.S. Supreme Court's landmark decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. Here to talk about the changing landscape for women's health care is Kelly Flynn. She is president and CEO of a Woman's Choice of Jacksonville, an obstetrics and gynecology medical clinic here. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you, Ann, for having me today.
Thank you so much for being here. So this is, in Florida, by far the largest decrease that we've seen in the country, really more than twice as high as other states. The latest numbers from the state show that the number of abortions in Florida is down by 17,000 in a one-year period. As I said, that's almost 46%. Can you kind of explain to us what that means? Is the net number of people getting abortions also declining?
What we can tell right now is that as a result of the 6-week ban, yes, the numbers have decreased. However, we're still seeing patients in our other clinics that aren't able to be seen here in Florida. We have noticed what we've had to do is to consolidate our days to where we can accommodate the patients, to see the numbers that we're seeing, which are declined.
Yeah. And your own clinic, I mean, to be clear, you have had to cut your hours significantly, or you have cut your hours significantly. The number of patients that you're seeing reflects that decline. Is that right?
Absolutely. So a year ago, when we had, right before the 6-week ban, our parking lot was full. We had probably 40 patients just before the 6-week ban trying to get in to be seen. Then right after that, the decline immediately happened. So many patients don't even know that they are pregnant at 6 weeks. So we are still able to accommodate most patients under 6 weeks, and those that are past the 6 weeks, we can send them to our North Carolina and Virginia office. And those are generally patients with means. It is difficult for patients to travel. We've done our best to help navigate this, to help patients get to, cross 2 states to be able to be seen. So we, this is a real problem with healthcare in the state, and the fact that it's gotten this far is cruel, and it's damaging to women's healthcare.
And so your own hours, you said that your parking lot used to be full, your waiting room used to be full. Now what is the reality that you're seeing?
It's our staff, they are very loyal. They are here for the patients. They are here for the cause. And we are doing our very best to take every single call that we can to help every patient that we can throughout the surrounding states, especially patients that are coming from Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, they're trying to find a way. We get patients that are still seeking help, so we try to navigate them to North Carolina and to Virginia right now.
We're going to have to take a short break. We're going to come back on the other side of the break. We are talking to Kelly Flynn. She's president and CEO of A Woman's Choice here in Jacksonville. We'll be back in just a minute.
WJCT Public Media invites you to a powerful night of cinema. Experience I'm Still Here, Academy Award winner for Best International Feature Film. Set in 1971 Brazil, witness a true story of a mother forced to rise against the darkness of dictatorship. Join us for this special screening Wednesday, June 18th at WJCT Studios. Tickets at wjct.org/film.
International state-sponsored hackers are worming their way into American cybersecurity companies. How? Through HR and things like fake job applicants from North Korean IT farms.
A lot of the times what they're doing is trying to kind of operate under the radar and have a consistent paycheck coming in to fund the regime.
How the cybersecurity industry is trying to keep itself secure. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
On the next Fresh Air, Benicio del Toro talks about his leading role in Wes Anderson's new film, The Phoenician Scheme. He'll look back on his film career and tell us about losing his mother when he was 9 and moving from Puerto Rico to Pennsylvania in his teens. Del Toro's other films and TV series include The Usual Suspects, Sicario, and Escape from Dannemora. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
Have you ever been wronged by someone, then had the urge to get back at them? The desire for revenge is not only common, it can be a form of addiction. We speak to a psychiatric researcher and a relationship therapist about why we seek revenge and what can go wrong when we do. That's next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, I am talking to Kelly Flynn. She is president and CEO of A Woman's Choice in Jacksonville, and we're talking about some new numbers on the number of abortions performed in the state that just came out, showing a nearly 46% decrease in the number of abortions performed in Florida. That's just in a one-year period. Talking about some of the impacts on patients and providers as well. So I want to just ask you, I mean, Florida has a 6-week ban, which basically means if you're beyond 6 weeks, you can't get an abortion in this state. There are some rare exceptions, but by and large, of the 17,000 some odd abortions that were performed in the state last year, most of them are first trimester and not beyond. So can you tell us what happens when you see a patient that comes in that is beyond that window?
Yes. So patients, when they schedule their appointment, they are required by the state to have a 24-hour in-person consent that has to be done by the physician. So the first part of their process, they come in, they have their lab work done, they do an ultrasound. If, in fact, they are over that 6-week mark, then they are unable to be seen. So we refer them to our clinic in North Carolina or Virginia. However, North Carolina has a 72-hour waiting period.
So they have a 12-week limit, but a longer waiting period.
That's correct.
So what happens when you send someone for a longer waiting period? They just go up, get seen, and then wait?
Yes, we do everything we can to try to get them consented in Florida if we have a physician or a nurse with a multi-state license, which is difficult to find sometimes. We've had a patient that got on a bus from Florida, went to North Carolina, got her 72-hour consent, turned around, got back on the bus, came back to Florida, took care of her children, then went back on the bus to North Carolina to have her procedure, to then come back. So round and round, she was on a bus for 96 hours to have an abortion.
That's a lot. And so, I mean, for people who are coming in and who do meet that window within the 6-week limit, and as you say, most women don't know that they're pregnant at 6 weeks. But for those that are able to come in and get service, what are the restrictions in Florida? Is it just the 24-hour limit? Are there other restrictions in place? There's the 24-hour waiting period.
Yeah, there's a 24-hour in-person waiting period and the 6 weeks, of course. So anything past that, if a patient presents at 6 weeks and 1 day, we are unable to see her. She has to go to another state or continue her pregnancy.
We've got a call. If you can pop your headphones on, you'll be able to hear the question. I think it's from Matt on the north side. Good morning, Matt. Welcome to First Coast Connect. Go ahead with your question.
Good morning, ladies. Thanks for your programming and support for NPR needs to continue. My question is, are there any kind of statistics indicating the number of women who are near death before a physician can go ahead and perform a medically needed abortion? Sometimes these are not scheduled, they are just emergencies. What kind of statistics do you have to show the ladies who are in dire near-death situations before they can get the help they need? Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Do you have that kind of data available?
Don't have the numbers. What I can tell you is that the exceptions are very restrictive. So if a patient presents with a medical emergency, life or death, then it's really up to the physician to make that decision. I know many physicians right now are afraid to approach that for fear of losing their license. And the other exception is fetal anomalies. Okay, so if a patient has fetal heart tones but knows that the pregnancy won't survive after delivery, she's still unable to terminate her pregnancy.
And there are certain cases, I think, that you have mentioned, something called anencephaly cases, where I guess the children typically don't survive longer than a couple hours or days, but very often that birth defect, very severe birth defect, isn't detected until, maybe 16 weeks into the pregnancy. So they're sort of well beyond this early first trimester.
Right, that's correct. And if a fetus still has fetal heart tones during that pregnancy, then the patient is unable to terminate. We'll have to continue that pregnancy and then deliver.
And so basically there is no option, at least in Florida.
Not in Florida, no.
Right. Some of your patients go to Virginia. That is a place that does not currently have any restrictions.
That's correct.
So that they are able to get service there. How are they able to manage the cost of travel, the cost of hotel stays, whatever else might be required? Is that just something that they come up with? Are you able to help them raise money?
Yes, we can help them. We have several organizations that help fund our patients. We have funding navigators that work for us that try to help the patients get the funds that they need. We've had people donate to a specific fund that we have at A Woman's Choice that also will help patients with lodging and travel and gas. So we do our very best to make sure that we get patients where they need to go to be seen.
Yeah. We should say we did reach out to the Right to Life folks here in Florida and invite them to participate, either call in or come on the show, and did not hear back. But we did want to talk about this important subject. Kelly Flynn, thank you so much for coming on this morning. We appreciate you. Thanks for all the good information.
Thank you for having me.
All right. And thank you for listening. If you have comments or questions, you can send
Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. Congaree & Penn, dedicated to agriculture and culinary endeavors, offering field-to-fork dining and outdoor experiences on over 300 acres. Sip, dine, explore. Information at congareeandpenn.com.